الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله خاتم النبيين المرسل رحمة للعالمين. وأصلي وأسلم وأبارك على آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم، نعوذ بك ونتوكل عليك ونستعيذك من أن نضل أو نضل أو نزل أو نزل أو أن نظلم أو نظلم أو أن نجهل أو نستجهل. يا نور السماوات والأرض، اجعل في قلوبنا نورا، وفي ألسننا نورا، وفي أعيننا نورا، واعظم لنا نورا، واجعل كلامنا مبرورا، وأحطه بنور. Inshallah, this is a special Jum'ah because it is the first Jum'ah for the Usuli Institute in its new home in Dublin, Ohio. To be very clear, of course, I remain a professor in Los Angeles at UCLA. But as those in attendance know, the library, which is the heart and soul of the Usuli Institute, the heart and soul of my own entire personal legacy, and the heart and soul of this intellectual project and this moral project, has been moved from Los Angeles to Dublin, Ohio. There's a lot to reflect on in this step. The why is clear enough. In Los Angeles, although the library had a full house dedicated to it, the way that the library lived prevented it from breathing. We had long run out of space. Books were stored in boxes upon boxes. Books were stored in doubled layers several times over. Many books were in piles on floors, which results in lack of accessibility to sources, because it's very difficult to find anything. And if you wish to find a source, you have to move piles of books to access the source. But also, when books are piled upon one another, collecting dust, rather than provided with breathing space, books deteriorate. And you cannot control the amount of damage that would affect any particular book, because often you can't see the damage until it's too late. It was critical that the library be given its due in honor and dignity, that it be preserved in a place that would pay proper dignity to that library with all that represents. So over the period of long weeks, students, God bless them, packed the library in boxes, over 100,000 volumes. The clear number is unknown, or the precise number is unknown. But over 100,000 volumes, hour upon hour, being packed in boxes to be shipped to Ohio, of course at considerable expense. And now in Ohio comes the enormous task of unpacking these boxes, reorganizing the library, a monumental task. But watching this process of packing sources, moving sources, and the inevitable unpacking of sources, the time commitment, the energy commitment, the financial commitments, ought to give you pause and is an invitation to reflect. You wonder if you just reflect upon how many sources were written throughout the Islamic civilization. The amount of texts that were produced on topics from everything from Sharia to science to astronomy, theology, philosophy, logic, medical manuals, engineering, military sciences, the enormous amount of texts that was produced by one of the most literary civilizations that humanity has known. Yes, Muslims do belong to a literary civilization. The one distinctive thing about the Islamic civilization is that in its centuries of existence, it produced more texts than the Jewish civilization or the Jewish existence over 6,000 years, and more texts than the Christian civilization since Rome decided that Christianity is the religion of the empire or the religion of the state. And more texts than anything that Buddhism or Hinduism have known. The one thing that you cannot deny about the Islamic civilization is in fact its textual production. That our Muslim predecessors felt the need to worship Allah not just in mosques and not just in prayer, but in the actual preservation and transmission of knowledge, which was considered a core act of ibadah in itself, so that most Muslims grow up fully aware of the various narrations that tell you that scholars are the inheritors of prophets, and that tell you an hour of study and reflection is worthy more than X amount of hours of prayer. We all grow up with these traditions. We all at one time or another know or learn that the very act of studying and investigating Allah's creation and learning from the experiences of past nations is in itself an act of ibadah. But ponder with me, if we have produced literally millions of texts throughout the Islamic civilization, ponder the army of people that were required through the Islamic ages, not just to write these texts, but the army of unsung heroes and unknown heroes that were required to carry these texts, to transport these texts, to document the existence of these texts. And throughout the Islamic civilization, with every foreign invasion, whether it was the Mongol invasion of Baghdad or the numerous crusades in the heartland of the Muslim world, in Sham and Palestine and Egypt, every time there was an invasion, there would be a massive effort to carry, load, and transport and save texts. Imagine the number of texts that were carried, loaded, transported when Andalusia fell, and the number of texts that had to be literally taken care of and taken care of by human beings in order for the heart and soul of the Islamic civilization to be preserved and reach us in some form or another today. What happens when human beings fail to take direct responsibility for the intellectual product of an ummah through its texts? What happens when you cannot find enough students to carry, load, transport, document, unpack, preserve? Well, consider the number of texts that the Mongols burned or threw in the river. Consider the number of texts that the Crusades burned. Consider the number of texts that the Reconquista in Andalusia destroyed. Consider the number of texts that were carried off from Palestine and from Sham to the heart of the papacy in Rome for centuries to be locked away as Rome created its own massive library of Islamic manuscripts. Consider the number of texts that the French, when they colonized many Muslim countries, either destroyed or carried off. Consider the number of texts that the British and the Dutch either destroyed or carried off. All these texts, I am sure that at a critical moment, there was some scholar who spent the night sleepless, full of anxiety and worry about the fate of the library. But I am sure that that scholar could not find enough people to carry this library to safety at the critical moment. Think about, we all know that the Mongols destroyed so many texts in Baghdad that the color of the Euphrates became black from the dissolved ink. Have you ever stopped to think about the places from which these texts came that were ultimately destroyed? All these texts had owners. All these texts had a Khalid Abou El Fadl. And I am sure at certain critical hours, that Khalid Abou El Fadl, sitting in Baghdad centuries ago, kept praying to Allah, please help me find people to transport these texts to safety. And I am sure that the very last minute before they saw their texts being carried away to be destroyed, they kept praying and hoping for the emergence of Muslims who would save these sources in history and in perpetuity. The role of the common Muslim mujahid is critical, but often underemphasized and underappreciated. All the greatest intellectual efforts are worthless unless at the critical moment the common average Muslim rises up to the duty that has fallen upon them by the natural movement of history and by Allah's qadar and Allah's decisions. I am sure that every library that languished in some dark basement and eventually was eaten by rats, Allah tested numerous Muslims in the fate of this library. Because I am sure that there were numerous Muslims at certain historical junctures, they could have saved that library, but they thought of themselves as too busy or too important to do so, or didn't understand the value of a library. And therein is Allah's test to an ummah. It's as simple as that. For every library that was destroyed by Mongols, Crusaders, Israelis, Spanish conquistadors, because yes, Israel, before it started preserving a lot of Muslim texts in Palestine, they were trying to engineer the historical record. So a lot of texts were lost or destroyed. Now imagine our collective responsibility as an ummah. But what is within a text? Because we live at a time where it is so important to go back to the simple ABCs of things. And let me underscore this point in the following straightforward way. Everything we do in life is based on the accumulation of knowledge. The reason that you wake up and drive a car, it's because of the accumulation of knowledge. The reason that you can turn on a coffee maker, it's because of the accumulation of knowledge. The reason that you can use a cell phone, it's because of an accumulation of knowledge. When you say things like my job, it's because of the accumulation of philosophical attitudes. When you say things like my paycheck and my money in my bank account, all of these are an accumulation of beliefs based on an accumulation of philosophical outlooks that gained ascendancy and dominance in society. When we say things like, why are you bothering me? Or I need space. Or I want to laugh. Or this is my sphere or space of autonomy. All of this reflects philosophical attitudes that were not inevitable. They're not inevitable. None of it is innate or intuitively natural. But all of it is the product of socialization. And this socialization is the product of an accumulation of knowledge. Put simply, whether we recognize it or not, we live and practice philosophy every minute of every day, in everything we say and everything we do, whether we know it's philosophy or not. When you think as to when your parents are transgressing upon your boundaries, or when you think about what your boundaries are, or when you think that you are entitled to a life separate and apart than your parents' wishes, or when parents think that they are entitled to direct and guide their children, all of that is the byproduct of cumulative philosophical outlooks that once upon a time were preserved in texts, taught from texts, and a collective socialization, a byproduct of education, took place. Here's the thing though. You cannot claim to have an original thought unless you truly vet whether that thought in fact is original. You cannot claim to be a creative thinker or an innovative thinker or an original thinker unless in fact you know what was thought before and what was said before. In other words, although your socialization is the product of the accumulation of knowledge, when we are being disingenuous and lazy and unintelligent, we try to pretend that we are innovative thinkers, creative thinkers, original thinkers, without going through the hard work of, in fact, vetting out whether what we are thinking or saying is, in fact, that creative or innovative or original. So it is the natural tendency of those who are intellectually lazy to engage in the disingenuous process of pretending that they are not the byproduct of cumulative socialization and acculturation. The earmark of an intellectually lazy person is that they like to engage in a game of pretend. I have ideas, I have thoughts, I have whatever. But they don't want to be bothered with whether in fact 100, 1,000, a million people have said the same thing, have thought the same thing, have tried the same thing before them for generations. They don't want to bother with studying what the result of these thought experiments were. So if other people thought the same thing, did they try them out? Well, what were the results of these trials? If you're having ideas that you are describing as creative and original, did others try these ideas out? What were the results? What can you learn from that? How can you contribute if you are not referring to the byproduct of those that came before you? This is why, as a matter of principle, the bank data of the Muslim civilization represented in every substantial library must survive. Whether that library is owned and controlled by a state, or that library is owned and controlled by an individual or a family. As long as these ideas of past generation continue to exist, at least preserved, then the hope and aspiration and dream of a better tomorrow continues to live on. Some of you might think, well, but in the age of electronics, do we really need to pack huge libraries, to move huge libraries, preserve huge libraries? I can tell you as a teacher, I hate it when students cite to electronic sites. Why? Because often when I return to these electronic sites, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, the site doesn't work. The link doesn't work. Whatever you are citing to, or whatever you are reading on the net, is as real as airwaves or electronics. It exists at the discretion of powers that you and I do not control. And that with a simple decision to crash a site, everything done in an electronic universe falls apart. There is no replacement to the integrity of the physical body, because virtuality is a very risky temptation. Whether that virtuality is in conversations between human beings, when they converse through texts rather than face-to-face, or whether that virtuality in relationships between human beings, or whether that virtuality in the preservation of knowledge and the preservation of the legacy of a civilization. When it came to a choice between cost, convenience, habit, the library had to take precedence. The library had to be honored and dignified, and the text had to breathe, had to have the space to breathe, so they can live on, at least offering the possibility of intellectual breakthroughs for future generations. Even if my generation failed to achieve the intellectual breakthroughs that are necessary to save this ummah, that are necessary for us to carry forward Ummah al-Islam, the Ummah of Muslims. May Allah bless the students who packed and labored and transported and suffered and engaged in the jihad that so many thousands before them throughout the Islamic civilization engaged in, serving the text. They were doing it not knowing that they belonged to a long honored tradition in the Islamic civilization, even if the modern Muslim psyche has become too colonized, too subjugated, to know that it is a long honored tradition. May Allah bless them and reward them. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم الله يستجيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Knowledge is an inevitable thing. None of us exist without data in our brains. This data is knowledge. It's there. The only question is whether it is good data or bad data. You have knowledge. You live with knowledge. But is your knowledge of the moral kind, of the virtuous kind, of the purposeful kind, or is it an accumulation of paradoxes, contradictions, and confusions? It is the nature of human beings to exist upon the accumulations of memory. Imagine what would happen if the slate was wiped clean and you truly tried to live without data. You would be as useless as a computer without a data bank. You wouldn't know who your mother is. You wouldn't know who your father is. You wouldn't know what your job is. You wouldn't know where you're from, where you're going. You wouldn't know anything. Allah has coded us on the premise and assumption of knowledge. The only question is, do you honor that knowledge? Do you realize the value of your humaneness or your status as a human being is thoroughly contingent on the quality of knowledge that enters that motor up there in your head? If you put the best in that head, it will give you the best. If you put the worst, it will give you the worst. It is the quality of what you input in that motor that Allah gave you which decides your fate and the fate of your family and the fate of your ummah and the fate of your nation and the fate of your people. I'm going to give you an odd example, but an example worth pondering. There is a hadith that you hear repeated often these days, in which the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, تأتي سنوات الخداعات, there will come false, deceptive, tricky years. What are these sanawat khada'at? What are these tricky years? Well, in these years, يصدق الكاذب ويكذب الصادق ويؤتمن الخائن. In these years, liars are going to be believed, and truthful people are not going to be believed. And faithful people will be called traitors and betrayed. And traitors and betrayers are going to be trusted and entrusted. And the hadith goes on to say, وَيَتَكَلَّمُ الرُّوَيْبِضَةِ. It's known as the Ruwaybidah hadith. The Ruwaybidah will speak. The Prophet ﷺ is asked, who are those Ruwaybidah, Prophet of God? The Prophet ﷺ says, الرجل التافه يتكلم, in one version في أمر العامة, in another version فيما لا يعني. That the simpleton, the التافه could mean the ignorant person, the stupid person, the worthless person, in other words, a person who doesn't respect himself and doesn't respect others, will pontificate upon public affairs. And the import of the hadith is that when that ignorant person pontificates upon public affairs, people will believe them and follow them. Now, note here, this hadith is part of our inherited, cumulative, psychological and intellectual outlook as Muslims. But what is the point of this hadith? Notice two possible outlooks among others. You could be reading this hadith to lament the age, as so many Muslims have done over the centuries. To say, the Prophet told us that things are going to get so terrible. The Prophet told us that there will be an age where good people will have no place, liars get ahead, cheats get ahead, ignorant people get ahead. And you could read this hadith basically as a prelude to say, that's why the world is messed up. So the best thing we can do is for me to take care of my family and ignore the rest. Or you could read this hadith as the Prophet ﷺ warning you to not allow such an age to come to be. And if it is, to fight it and resist it with all your might and effort. Because it describes a state of being that is cursed by God and abandoned by God. The data is there. The information is there. But it is your own outlook and moral anchoring and acculturation that is going to direct that data in a defeated way or in an aspirational way. This is the case with all intellectual legacies. They offer you a weapon to meet the challenges of the day and age in which you live. But they don't tell you how to use that weapon. They don't tell you whether you use it to commit suicide against the self or use it to defend yourself and survive and flourish. That depends on you and your moral outlook and your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah make us among those who understand the value of accumulated knowledge, standing silent on their shelves until the person comes to tap into that treasure, and realize the value and the power that it offers, so that Muslims do not remain the laughing stock of humanity, the tail of humanity, the byproduct of humanity. Because we, as followers of Islam, deserve much more than that. Personally, I go back to very micro examples to understand everything. And I'm going to end the khutbah with this. As we are in the process of setting up for the library in its new home, I had an occasion to drive around, or be driven around, more precisely, in beautiful Dublin, Ohio, with its very beautiful homes, very quiet atmosphere, very serene environment, very beatific. And watch people at stores go in with their masks, doing their purchases, getting in cars, driving, and I kept thinking to myself, I know what I am thinking about tonight, but I wonder what goes on, what is in the mind of these people as they're doing their purchases, driving their cars, going back home. It looks like everyone goes to bed very early. Dublin goes to bed at night very early in Dublin, Ohio. It's a very sleepy town. Looks like by 8 o'clock everyone is in bed. Do you know where my thoughts were? I wish my thoughts were with something so pleasant as making a purchase, going home, having dinner, settling with your family, going to bed. I was comparing between my state in the United States and the state of a young Muslim scholar that I've talked about before, Ahmed Sabih. This man continues to languish in Egyptian prisons. Why? All this man did was learn Aramaic and Hebrew and read Aramaic texts and Hebrew texts and study the history of the formation of a biblical text and talk about it. All this man did was engage in the type of activity that we engage in all the time. But he has to pay with his entire life. His family is destitute as the father languages in prison. Why? Because this man said that the Trinity doesn't make sense. Something that a lot of committed Christians say all the time. Because this man said that the Trinity cannot be found in the text of the Bible. Something that a lot of devout Christians say all the time. Because this man said that there are many versions of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and a lot of these versions contradict one another, are inconsistent with one another. Something that in the field of biblical studies it is said all the time. This is the sole crime of this man. The sole crime of this man is that he learned and perfected Aramaic. And he learned and perfected Hebrew. And what is his reward? To be arrested in Egypt, charged criminally. And it looks like he is going to get at least 15 to 20 years in prison for daring to speak about the Trinity and the Bible. As I am going home, thinking of Allah's tests to me, this is going to cost us this much, this is going to cost us that much, I have problems with this, I have problems with that, I have these medical issues, there is another human being. I could have seen myself in this as this human being because I did my best to learn Aramaic at Princeton. And I did my best to learn Hebrew. And I never got as good as I wanted to be. But he's much better. He's much better in Hebrew than I ever was. I'm actually quite amazed at how good his Hebrew is. The thing that we engage in so easily, this man, his fate for daring to look at scholarship is to be arrested and thrown in prison. And why do I talk about him? Because here is where the truth of human rights reveals itself. How many human rights activists spoke on his behalf? 0. How many human rights organizations demanded his release? 0. How many civic organizations cared about a Muslim who is languishing in prison because of his only crime is free speech? The type of free speech, we all remember Salman Rushdie. We all remember the Egyptian professor who was divorced from his wife under accusations of apostasy, and the whole controversy about him, and how he was given asylum by the Netherlands and turned into an honored professor and given a professorship and a job for his entire life, no one cares about Ahmed Sabih. No one cares about a Muslim scholarly voice. My child, I am sure, his biggest problem is school and what game he's going to play tonight. Your children and my children, their issues are their careers and perhaps romantic relationships and perhaps job security and things like that. But if you wonder why the Muslim Ummah is where it is, you need go no further than look at the story of someone like Ahmed Sabih. And the fact that this entire Muslim Ummah cannot do a thing to help Ahmed Sabih gain his freedom. But if President Biden decides with a single phone call, he can change the entire fate of Ahmed Sabih. There isn't an Islamic organization on the face of this earth that can help someone like Ahmed Sabih. But you know what? The papacy in Rome can secure his freedom with a single phone call. If that doesn't tell you what Allah expects from us, what type of life Allah wants us to spend, I don't know what will. May Allah be with him and his family, and may Allah help him, and may Allah bring him to safety and secure his release. And may Allah hold to account all those Muslims who refuse to condemn the criminal government in Egypt that persecutes someone like Ahmed Sabih. All those Egyptians in places like the Islamic Center of Southern California that are apologists for a regime that targets people like Ahmed Sabih and imprison them. And why? Because they have an apartment in Egypt that they want to make sure is always safe and secure, and that the government never takes it away from them. That's all. They are willing to be apologists for Caesar's regime. Why? Because their summer home in Egypt, or their summer home in Alexandria, or their summer home on the Red Coast, on the coast of the Red Sea. What do you say about this ummah? What do you say about these people? Allahumma afu anna. Allahumma aghfir lana. Allahumma ahdina li aqraba min hadha rashada ya Ali ya Azim. Allahumma arda anna warfa ghadabaka wa maqtaka anna ya Rabb. Allah, forgive our sins. Grant us the straight path, to guide us to the straight path, and to illumination and enlightenment. Fill us with your light and your love and your mercy and your compassion. And empower us to reverse the course on our errors and flaws. May we serve you better, Ya Allah, Ya Rabbal Alameen. Aqim as-salah.